It was the summer of 2005, and my buddy Dave and I had planned a camping trip deep in the Ozark National Forest. We were both in our early 30s, working stressful jobs in the city, and figured a long weekend off the grid would do us good. We chose a remote spot. No marked trails, no campsites, just miles of trees, hills, and absolute quiet. Dave had a beat-up Chevy Blazer, and it groaned its way up the gravel forest road until we couldn't go any farther. From there, we hiked in another mile or so, carrying our gear until we found a flat clearing near a creek. It was perfect. The sound of running water in the distance, the breeze rustling through the pines, and not a single sign of another person. We set up camp, 2 small tents, a fire pit, and a cooler filled with beer and whiskey. The first day was bliss. We fished in the creek, grilled what we caught over the fire, and stayed up late swapping stories under a sky filled with stars. Felt like the escape we needed. The trouble started on the second night. Around midnight, I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard a scream. Not a person, but something else, high-pitched, raw, and almost human-like. It made my skin crawl. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. A moment later, it came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. I unzipped my tent and crawled out to find Dave already outside, flashlight in hand. His face was pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I replied, scanning the dark forest around us. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the shadows. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. The scream came again, distant now but still unnerving. "Cougar," I said finally, though I wasn't sure. I'd heard stories about them making sounds like a woman screaming, but hearing it in person was something else entirely. Neither of us slept much that night. We sat by the dying fire, clutching our flashlights and a bottle of whiskey, jumping at every snap of a twig. The forest felt alive, like it was watching us. By dawn, the screams had stopped, and the forest was quiet again. We were exhausted, but the daylight brought some comfort. We decided to stick it out, figuring it was just a passing animal and nothing to worry about. Later that morning, as we were making coffee over the campfire, we heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle. It was faint at first, the low rumble of an engine bouncing through the trees. We looked at each other, confused. We were miles from the nearest road, and we hadn't seen a single soul since we got there. The sound grew louder, and soon an old, rusted pickup truck came into view, puttering up the narrow path that barely qualified as a road. The truck stopped a few yards from our camp, and an older man stepped out. He was probably in his late 60s, wiry and weathered, with a dog at his side. He had a revolver holstered on his hip, which immediately made me uneasy. We weren't armed, at least not in any meaningful way. I had a shotgun, but it was in the car, unloaded and practically useless at this point. A paranoid thought crossed my mind. He has a gun, and we're in the middle of nowhere. If he wanted to, he could do whatever he wanted, and no one would ever know. But then he smiled, a warm, toothy grin, and my nerves eased a bit. He looked like the kind of guy who'd spent his life out here, someone who knew the land and the people better than anyone. His dog wagged its tail and sniffed around our camp as he ambled over to us. The man was friendly, just passing through, he said, checking on some hunting trails nearby. He carried himself with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from years of experience in the woods. Still, I couldn't stop glancing at the gun on his hip. We offered him a cup of coffee, and he accepted, sitting down on a log by the fire. He seemed harmless enough, and his presence actually felt reassuring after the night we'd had. At some point, Dave mentioned the screams we'd heard the night before, asking if he had any idea what it could have been. The man nodded, scratching his scruffy beard. He said it was likely a cougar, maybe a black bear, though they usually didn't make sounds like that. Coyotes were another possibility, but he didn't seem convinced. Then he said something that stuck with me. He leaned back, looking out at the trees, and said, "The animals out here, most of them won't bother you. Black bears, cougars, coyotes. They'll keep their distance if you don't mess with them. But the ones you gotta watch out for, they walk on two legs." A chill ran down my spine. He wasn't trying to scare us. It was just a matter-of-fact statement, like he was talking about the weather. He sipped his coffee, patted his dog, and said we'd be fine as long as we stayed aware. The man hung around for a while, chatting about hunting and fishing, then finished his coffee, wished us well, and headed back to his truck. We watched him drive off, the sound of his engine fading into the distance until it was gone. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but his words stuck with me. Every time I glanced at the forest, I found myself thinking about what he'd said. The night fell again, and though we didn't hear any more screams, the unease lingered. Every sound, every shadow seemed suspicious. The trip ended without incident, and we packed up and hiked back to the car the next day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest, once a place of peace and escape, now felt different, darker, heavier, like it was hiding something. Years later, I still think about that trip, about the old man and his words. I've been camping many times since, but I always keep my guard up, always remember that the most dangerous things out there aren't the animals. They're the people. And I always wonder if, somewhere out in those woods, someone else is watching, waiting for the next camper who lets their guard down. Camping at the edge of the Arizona desert was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. It was July 2018, and we had chosen a remote campground just outside Sedona for its quiet surroundings and stunning views. My husband, Dan, and I thought it would be a perfect way to introduce our 3-year-old daughter, Lily, to the joys of nature. We had spent the day hiking short trails, letting Lily splash around in a shallow creek, and watching the sunset paint the red rocks golden. That night, as the stars lit up the vast sky, Lily fell asleep early in her small camping cot inside our tent. Dan and I sat around the fire, talking in hushed tones to avoid waking her. The air was still warm, even as the desert night began to cool. We finally crawled into the tent around 10 p.m., exhausted but happy. The next morning, the sun rose quickly, and so did the temperature. By 9 a.m., it was already uncomfortably hot. We decided to eat a quick breakfast and figure out our plans for the day. Lily sat in her camp chair with her favorite stuffed bear while Dan prepared coffee. I packed up some of our things and tidied the campsite. Everything felt normal, peaceful, even. Then Lily was gone. One moment, she was sitting in her chair, humming softly to herself. The next, the chair was empty. I didn't see her leave. I didn't hear her move. I assumed she had wandered just a few steps away to pick up a stick or chase a butterfly. But when I called her name and she didn't answer, my chest tightened. I spun around, scanning the campsite. She wasn't there. "Dan, where's Lily?" I remember asking, though my voice was already rising in panic. I ran toward the nearby bushes, thinking maybe she'd wandered behind them. Nothing. I looked under the picnic table, behind the cooler, in the tent. Each second stretched impossibly long. The realization hit me like a punch in the stomach. She was gone. Dan and I sprang into action, shouting her name as we searched every corner of the campsite. My legs felt weak, but I forced them to keep moving, checking behind trees, rocks, and anything else big enough for a child to hide behind. The campground wasn't huge, but it was surrounded by open desert, and the thought of her wandering off into the harsh, sun-scorched landscape made my stomach churn. I checked the van, which was parked a few feet from our tent. The sliding door was closed, just as we had left it. I opened it quickly, glanced inside, and called her name. It was empty, or at least I thought it was. I slammed the door shut and kept running, shouting her name until my throat burned. Other campers began to notice the commotion. Some joined in the search while others looked on, unsure of how to help. I could feel their eyes on me, their unspoken questions. Where could a child go so quickly? Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The desert heat was becoming unbearable. I ran to a nearby site, asking if anyone had seen a small girl. My voice cracked, and tears blurred my vision. I couldn't think straight. Every terrible possibility played out in my mind. What if she wandered into the desert and collapsed from the heat? What if someone took her? What if got her? Dan's voice cut through the panic. I turned and saw him standing by the van, holding Lily in his arms. Relief washed over me so powerfully that my legs nearly gave out. But then I realized where she had been. Dan said he'd found her inside the van. Inside the van I had just checked. I stared at him, not understanding. Then it hit me. She must have been hiding, playing one of her surprise hide-and-seek games. I had taught her that game a few months earlier, thinking it was harmless fun. And I had also shown her how to open and close the van doors, never imagining she'd use that knowledge like this. Lily had crawled under a pile of clothes we had left in the back seat, making herself nearly invisible. When I opened the door earlier, I must have missed her completely. And when I shut the door, I trapped her inside a metal box heating up to deadly temperatures. The weight of what could have happened crushed me. It was over 100 degrees that day. The van was parked directly in the sun. If Dan hadn't found her when he did, if I hadn't checked the van at all, I couldn't finish the thought. Lily was fine, sweaty and confused, but unharmed. She giggled as Dan carried her, as if the whole thing had been part of the game. She didn't understand what had just happened, what could have happened, but I did. I grabbed her from Dan, holding her so tightly that she squirmed and complained. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered apologies she couldn't fully comprehend. We didn't stay another night. The campsite, once a place of joy and adventure, felt like a threat now. We packed up quickly and drove to a nearby town, where we rented a small cabin. It wasn't what we had planned, but it felt safe. That night, after Lily was asleep, I sat on the cabin's porch, staring out at the stars. My body was still trembling from the adrenaline. I kept replaying the day in my head, imagining all the ways it could have gone differently. In some other version of events, Dan didn't think to check the van. In some other universe, I hadn't taught Lily how to open and close those doors. But we were here. Lily was alive. Even now, years later, I feel sick when I think about it. The memory still wakes me up at night. But I've learned something from it: vigilance. Small moments, small decisions, they can change everything. That camping trip was supposed to be a chance to relax, to connect with nature and each other. Instead, it taught me how quickly life can shift from joy to terror. We haven't been camping since. I was 15 when my parents decided we'd go camping in a remote area of eastern Oregon in the summer of 1997. It wasn't the first time we'd gone camping together, but this trip felt different from the start. My parents, both in their late 40s at the time, had chosen a spot deep in the wilderness, miles away from the nearest paved road. My dad loved the idea of being as far from civilization as possible. I didn't mind camping, but this kind of isolation always made me uneasy. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon after driving for hours along dusty, winding roads. The site was beautiful, surrounded by towering pines and a clear, rocky creek running just a few yards away. The air smelled like earth and pine sap, and there wasn't another soul in sight. It was peaceful, but the silence pressed down on me in a way I couldn't explain. We spent the evening setting up camp. My dad pitched the tent while my mom and I unpacked the cooler and prepped dinner. We had steaks cooked over the fire, followed by s'mores for dessert. The familiar ritual of roasting marshmallows over the flames helped settle my nerves a little. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, I was feeling more relaxed. After dinner, we sat around the fire, talking about nothing in particular. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. My parents seemed happy, and I didn't want to ruin the mood by voicing my unease. Still, the quietness of the forest felt too complete, like the world had gone still just for us. We finally turned in for the night, zipping ourselves into the small two-room tent. My parents had one side, and I had the other, separated by a thin nylon divider. The fire outside had burned low, its glow barely visible through the tent's mesh window. I lay there, staring at the shadowy outlines of the trees, trying to will myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. It started as a faint rustling, like something moving through the brush. I told myself it was probably just the wind or a small animal, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, moving closer to the tent. Whatever it was, it wasn't small. The rustling turned into snapping branches, and then I heard a low, guttural growl. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might wake my parents. The growl came again, deep and menacing. I didn't need to see it to know what it was. A mountain lion. The tent felt like a flimsy barrier between us and the predator circling outside. I could hear its heavy footsteps, the soft crunch of leaves under its paws. It was moving around the tent, pausing every so often before continuing its path. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The growls grew louder, angrier. The mountain lion was circling closer, and I could hear it sniffing at the edges of the tent. My dad must have realized what it was, too, because everything inside the tent was dead silent. No one dared move, not even to breathe too loudly. Minutes felt like hours as we lay there, listening to the big cat prowl around us. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen. Would it try to claw its way into the tent? Was it hungry?
Territorial.
The fear was overwhelming, and I could feel the sweat pooling on my back despite the cool night air. The mountain lion let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound I didn't even know they could make. It echoed through the trees, and my whole body tensed. It was so close, I could almost feel the vibration of the sound. Then, something strange happened. The fire outside, which had been little more than glowing embers, suddenly flared back to life. The flames shot up, bright and fierce, illuminating the campsite. The light and heat were so sudden and intense that it startled the mountain lion. I heard it let out another growl, but this one sounded more like fear than aggression. It backed away from the tent, its footsteps retreating into the darkness. We stayed frozen for what felt like forever, listening for any sign that it might return. But the forest was silent again, save for the crackling of the newly blazing fire. I didn't understand how it had reignited. There was no wind, no spark to explain it. Eventually, my dad unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was burning strong, as if someone had just stoked it. There was no sign of the mountain lion, only the stillness of the forest. We didn't sleep much that night. None of us talked about what had happened, but I could see the unease in my parents' faces. We stayed in the tent until dawn, then packed up and left the campsite as quickly as we could. On the drive home, my mom mentioned that we'd camped not far from where her father, my grandfather, had grown up and passed away. She didn't say much more, but I could tell she was trying to connect the dots in her own way. I didn't know what to think. I wasn't a superstitious person, and I didn't believe in anything supernatural. But the way that fire flared up just in time to save us didn't make sense. To this day, I don't have an explanation. Maybe there's a logical reason. A stray ember reignited the flames, or something in the wood caused it to flare up. All I know is that it happened and it saved us. I'll never forget the sound of that mountain lion, the terror of waiting in the dark, and the strange, almost impossible timing of that fire. The wilderness doesn't care about you. It's wild, unpredictable, and sometimes it's terrifying. That night reminded me just how small and vulnerable we are out there, and it's a lesson I've never forgotten. I've worked as a park ranger in South Carolina for nearly 10 years. That night, the rain was coming down hard as I drove through the park, checking the campgrounds. The dirt trails were turning to thick, sticky mud, and the trees seemed alive with the constant dripping of water. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap under the weight of the rain. Nights like this always put me on edge. Heavy rain could mean flooding or fallen trees. Worse, someone could wander off the trail and get lost. I stopped my truck at the start of a trail leading to a remote camping area. Grabbing my rain jacket and flashlight, I stepped out into the storm. The rain drowned out most sounds, leaving only the steady pattering and the squelch of my boots in the mud. My flashlight cut through the darkness, lighting up the slick path in front of me. About half a mile in, I noticed a faint, flickering light up ahead. It looked like a lantern someone had left behind. When I got to the campsite, something felt off right away. The tent was soaked and half collapsed. The fire pit was filled with water. The lantern sat on the ground, flickering weakly, but there was no one around. I called out, but the rain swallowed my voice. I walked around the site, looking for any sign of the camper. The mud around the tent was covered in footprints, but they weren't normal. They were scattered, like the person had been stumbling or running. My stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The tracks led away from the tent and into the woods. I followed them, shining my flashlight low to keep the trail in sight. The rain made it harder to see, but the tracks were deep enough to follow. They led to a creek that was now swollen with rushing water. The tracks stopped right at the edge of the creek. I scanned the area, my heart racing. My flashlight's beam caught something on the other side of the creek, a torn backpack. Its contents were scattered across the muddy ground. I waded through the freezing water and picked it up. Inside, I found a wallet with an ID. The name on it was David. I remembered that name from earlier in the day when I checked the camping permits. He'd been camping alone. My gut told me something bad had happened, but I didn't know what. I radioed the ranger station to report what I'd found and asked for backup. Then I started heading back to the campsite, trying to keep my nerves in check. The rain was soaking through my jacket, and the cold was starting to bite. But what really bothered me was the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I got back to the campsite, the lantern was off. That didn't make sense. I hadn't touched it, and it shouldn't have died so quickly. I swung my flashlight around, scanning the area. That's when I saw them. New tracks in the mud, much larger than before, circling the campsite. I didn't stay to figure out what made them. I got in my truck and drove straight back to the station. By the time help arrived, the rain had washed away most of the tracks. We searched the area for hours but found no sign of David or whatever had been there. Days turned into weeks, and David's family put up missing posters and offered rewards, but nothing ever came of it. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. I still patrol that park, even on stormy nights, but I don't feel safe anymore. Sometimes, when it rains, I think I see flickering lights deep in the woods where no campsite should be. I don't follow them. I know better now. Whatever happened to David, I'm certain it wasn't an accident. Something out there is watching, waiting, and the rain just seems to bring it closer. I've always liked camping in quiet places, far from the noise of the city. So when my friend told me about his family's old farm near a small village, I thought it sounded perfect. He said the farm had been empty for years and no one ever went there. That sounded like exactly the kind of peace and quiet I needed. Getting there took longer than I thought. The village was tiny, with just a few houses and dirt roads. From the village, I had to walk about a mile to reach the farm. By the time I got there, the sun was already setting. The field was overgrown with weeds and tall grass. The air smelled like damp earth and plants. The old barn stood off in the distance, its roof leaning, and the walls covered in vines. I decided to set up my tent in the middle of the field, away from the barn. As the sun went down, the place became dead silent. There wasn't even a breeze, just the sound of crickets in the dark. I started a small fire, ate a sandwich, and sat there staring at the flames. At first, it felt peaceful, but as time passed, I started feeling uneasy. The silence felt wrong, like the whole place was waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. It was soft, like something moving through the grass. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a stray dog. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, and this time it was closer. It didn't sound like random rustling. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, listening hard. The noise stopped. My heart was pounding, and my hands were sweaty. After a while, I convinced myself I was overreacting. But just when I started to relax, the sound came back. This time, it was coming from the direction of the barn. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the barn. The light lit up the broken boards and the tall grass swaying slightly, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was nothing and crawled back into my tent, zipping it up as tightly as I could. I barely slept that night. Every little noise outside made me jump. Then, at around 3 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. They were slow and steady, moving around my tent. My chest tightened, and I held my breath. The sound stopped right outside my tent. I stared at the thin tent wall, expecting to see a shadow or hear something, but nothing happened. The air felt heavy, and I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, heading back toward the barn. As soon as the sky started getting light, I decided to leave. I didn't bother eating or packing properly. I just threw everything into my bag as fast as I could. While rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed something in the dirt outside my tent. Shoe prints, big ones. They were deep, like whoever had made them had been standing there for a long time. My stomach sank. Someone had been out there watching me. I felt sick as I grabbed my stuff and walked quickly back toward the village. When I got there, I stopped at a small shop to buy water. The man behind the counter glanced at me and said, "You camped at the old farm, didn't you?" I nodded, too shaken to say anything. He didn't ask anything else. He just shook his head slowly, like he already knew something I didn't. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know why the farm had been abandoned or what might have happened there in the past. All I knew was I wasn't going back. As I walked out of the shop, I turned around for one last look at the path leading to the farm. That's when I saw them. Far down the road, almost too far to make out, two figures standing side by side. They weren't moving. They were just watching. I turned away and didn't look back again. During my ranger training, they sent us deep into the forests of Montana. The goal was simple: survive on our own and watch the wildlife. They gave us only the basics: a tent, a knife, some rope, and a map. I was paired with another trainee, Jackson, but we had clear orders to split up. We had 3 days to follow different routes and meet back at the base camp. It was a test to see if we could handle being alone out there. The first day went okay. I hiked through the thick forest, marked my checkpoints, and set up my tent near a small stream by sunset. The woods were quiet, except for the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze or a distant animal call. I kept my fire small so nothing would come too close and tried to sleep, though the silence felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The second day was when things started to feel wrong. As I walked, I noticed strange things. A branch snapped clean off but hanging low, almost like someone had twisted it. Then I spotted footprints. They were big, way too big to be mine, and fresh enough to make my stomach churn. They didn't look like boot prints either. They were wide, more like bare feet. I tried to convince myself it could be an animal, though I couldn't think of any that would leave marks like that. Still, I kept moving. By the time the sun started to set, I stumbled on something even stranger. Hidden under some bushes was a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly like a little tower. It didn't look natural. Someone had made it. My chest tightened as I realized we were supposed to be the only ones out here. I packed up quickly, walked a few miles further, and set up camp again in a clearing where I could see all around me. I kept my knife close that night, but sleep didn't come easy. I woke up to soft sounds outside my tent. Twigs snapping, something heavy crunching the ground as it moved. I froze, gripping my knife tightly, my heart racing so loud I thought it would give me away. Whatever it was circled my tent. I could hear it breathing, slow and steady, like it wasn't in a rush. Eventually, the sounds faded, but I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to even blink. By the third day, I just wanted to get back to base. That feeling of being watched had grown worse. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was being pulled back. As I followed the map, I saw more of those rock piles, only now there were more of them. Some were big, others small, placed right in the middle of my trail. They didn't feel random. It was like someone had left them there on purpose. Then I saw something that made me stop cold. In a clearing, there was a deer lying on its side. It had been gutted, skinned, and left there, but not like something a predator would do. The cuts were too clean, too precise. Beside it was an old backpack, dirty and ripped. It wasn't mine, and it didn't look like something anyone in our group would carry. I didn't stay to check it out. I picked up my pace, trying not to think about who might have done it, or if they were still close by. The last part of the hike was the worst. The trees grew thicker, the air felt heavier, and barely any sunlight got through. That's when I heard it again. Heavy footsteps, slow but deliberate, coming from behind me. They weren't far, and they weren't trying to be quiet. My whole body froze for a second, but I forced myself to keep walking. I didn't dare turn around. My legs felt like they were moving through mud, but I didn't stop. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the base camp ahead, relief hit me like a wave. But just as I was about to step into the open, I glanced back. At the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It was tall, with ragged clothes that looked like they'd been through years of weather. His face was in shadow, but it wasn't moving. It was just watching me. I stumbled into camp, shaking, and told the instructors everything. They brushed it off, said I was probably stressed or imagining things. They told me the woods can mess with your head when you're out there alone. I didn't argue. I just wanted to be anywhere but there. But I know what I saw. That thing wasn't in my head, and it wasn't some trick of the light. It had been following me, watching me, and letting me know I wasn't alone. Even now, I wonder what would have happened if I turned around on that trail, or if I hadn't made it to base in time. Whatever it wasn't done with me. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up and swear I hear those same heavy footsteps outside my window. We decided to camp in a remote spot up in the mountains, far away from the usual places people go. It wasn't our first time camping, but something about this place felt different. First, everything seemed fine. The weather was great, and we had a small campfire going while I set up the tent. My wife was unpacking the cooler, but I noticed how quiet it was. Way too quiet. It wasn't the normal peace you get when you're out in nature. This silence felt heavy, like something was just beyond our sight, watching us. As the night went on, the fire crackled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept glancing toward the trees, like I was expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the shadows swaying in the breeze. We were about to go to bed when I heard a noise in the bushes nearby. I froze, listening. It wasn't the usual animal sounds, more like something was carefully moving through the underbrush. My wife didn't seem to hear it. She was too busy reading her book. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness and only hit trees. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but something about that moment stuck with me. When we crawled into the tent, the sound of branches snapping came again. But this time it was much closer. My heart started to pound, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We weren't alone in these woods anymore. I was sure of it. I tried to stay calm for her, but the sounds kept coming, moving around us. It was too quiet to be an animal. Animals don't move like that. I stepped outside, pretending to check the fire, but I was really trying to see anything in the dark, anything that might explain the sounds. The temperature had dropped quickly, and there was no moon, just complete darkness all around. Then I saw it. In the distance, barely visible between the trees, I saw a figure. It wasn't moving like a person. It was stiff, jerky, like it was trying to stay hidden. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, not taking my eyes off it, then rushed back into the tent. I didn't know what to do. Should I get the car keys and drive away? But if we left, I was sure whatever that thing was would follow us. I didn't think we'd make it out alive. Couldn't sleep that night. Every little sound seemed to echo through the stillness. I kept my eyes glued to the tent flap, knowing whatever was out there could slip right in if it wanted. It was torture. When the first light of day finally came, I felt a sense of relief. The noises had stopped. The air didn't feel so thick with dread. My wife was still asleep, completely unaware of everything that happened. I packed up quickly, trying to finish as fast as I could. I felt like if I slowed down, something would catch up to me, and I wasn't sure I'd get away. I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head. It was still waiting out there, hidden just beyond the trees. On the drive back home, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. But there was nothing. The road behind us was empty, and the forest seemed peaceful again. But I knew better. We never went back to that spot. And to this day, I don't know what was out there with us that night, but I can still feel its presence. It was real, and it knew we were there. The worst part is, I'm not sure if it ever left. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'll hear a sound outside, and I'll freeze, thinking it's back. And I don't know if I'm ready to face it again. What I saw that night wasn't something I could explain. It wasn't a person, an animal, or anything I've ever encountered before. It was something far worse, and it knew we were alone.